Je regarde la salle.
I look around the room.
Je vois que la réaction est positive.
I see the reaction is positive.
Je n'entends pas d'objection.
I don't hear any objections.
L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.
The Paris Climate Agreement is accepted.
A small hammer blow that has gone down in history as a major turning point. On December 12, 2015, 196 parties, countries rich and poor, large and small, agreed to limit global warming and work together to adapt to the effects of climate change. In this podcast, we'll hear from key international players in the climate transition, and with them, we'll explore the global impact of this landmark agreement 10 years on. We'll also look ahead. How can the next decade become one of profound change? Climate Emergency, 10 Years to Act, Promises and Reality of the Paris Agreement is a podcast from IDDRI, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, co-produced with RFI.
Episode 1, Behind the Scenes of an Historic Agreement.
Alors vous l'avez fait.
So you've done it.
Vous avez réussi là où il y avait eu l'échec.
You've succeeded where there was failure 6 years ago.
Nous entrons dans l'ère.
We're entering the low-carbon era. It's a powerful and unstoppable movement.
Puissant et irréversible.
The knowledge that the next generation will be better off for what we do here. Can we imagine a more worthy reward than that? Let's get to work.
This is a historic moment because it was not easy, and this has given a new hope.
When there is an agreement, there are inevitably winners and losers. But I think that in the end, everyone is a little bit of a winner and everyone is a little bit of a loser.
Suddenly, everyone started speaking with one voice, saying very clearly, this is the best deal for humanity. This is the best deal for business. This is the best deal for the planet.
Ceci est le meilleur accord pour la planète.
Toutes les exigences.
Not all demands have been met.
Mais on ne sera pas jugé
But we will not be judged by a word, but by an act.
Pas sur un jour.
Not by a day, but by a century.
Mais sur un siècle.
Quand on revoit de temps en temps les images.
When I watch it again, as we do from time to time, it triggers exactly the same incredible reaction, this feeling of, it's not possible, we actually did it.
C'est pas possible, on y est arrivé.
This is Laurence Tubiana talking. She's an economist and she was the chief negotiator for COP21 for the French government.
In fact, our Chinese friends, every time we have meetings with them, show this film, and each time it brings back exactly that same emotion.
There's not much between success and failure.
And this is Laurent Fabius speaking. In 2015, he was French Foreign Affairs Secretary and he chaired the Paris COP.
I struck with my hammer early in the afternoon, but in the morning when I got up after a sleepless night, I wasn't at all sure it would work because the countries were still reluctant. Afterwards, it was a moment of great joy. There, you had the whole world, heads of state, ministers. Often they don't show their emotions. And there were people crying in every corner because they had worked for years and all of a sudden it became possible.
Alongside these two key French players in the Paris Agreement, Todd Stern was often seen among the delegations. He was negotiating on behalf of the US. And on December 12, like everyone else, he had just had a sleepless night.
There was a moment earlier, maybe around 12 o'clock or so, Fabius called everybody into the big plenary room and talked about what was going to happen for the rest of the day. They were going to send out the final draft and then we'd come back. And nobody had seen the last draft for the last couple of days, and yet everybody was standing up and clapping. And I think the leadership created a sense that this was inevitable and this was happening now.
Inevitable, a word that allows us to measure the distance travelled, because 2 years earlier, when France was chosen to host COP21 in 2015, hardly anyone believed it, recalls Laurence Tubiana. She had left the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations, which she had co-founded, IDDRI in French, and producer of this podcast series, to launch herself into this diplomatic battle alongside Laurent Fabius.
D'abord, c'était l'apprentissage de ce qui n'avait pas marché, parce que cet accord de Paris...
First, it involved learning from what hadn't worked. You have to recognise that the Paris Agreement came very late, after multiple attempts and failures, including in Copenhagen, since the goal back then, in 2009, was already to reach a global agreement. From 2009 to 2015, we had time to think it all through. France decided quite early, but also in a way quite late, to apply to host this COP. There were no other candidates, since naturally everyone was afraid of another failure.
The French quickly became convinced that the debate had to take place in every country in the world. They created a method and put together a team, and notably activated an invaluable asset, its diplomatic network, one of the most extensive in the world.
La première réunion qu'il y a eu sur le climat.
The first meeting on climate, and maybe even one of the only ones to be held in Pakistan, was at the French embassy in Pakistan. And suddenly the ambassadors became facilitators of debate, speaking with parliamentarians, NGOs, journalists, industrialists, sometimes the military. The embassy became the place where people talked about climate. And that was extraordinary because, firstly, they all did it with huge talent, and because Laurent Fabius, the chief negotiator, asked them every week to send a report on what they'd done.
2 years of so-called 360 degrees diplomacy and, on average, 1 trip around the world per month for Laurent Fabius and his team, with the desire to build trust with everyone, both rich countries, so-called developed, and with the major emerging countries, and also with developing countries, including those most vulnerable to climate change, particularly small islands.
What's very important is to build trust. That is, the delegates who are there don't get the feeling that you have a ready-made text in your pocket and that basically the 15 days are just designed to entertain the audience and that on the last day you'll come out with the text you wrote before. No, it's a co-production, a co-construction. The problem isn't being sure you're right, saying, I'm the strongest, I'm the best, we're right. You have to understand the other person's point of view. And that's where diplomacy and dialogue come in. And you have to listen to everyone.
Listening and building trust. That's the method which proved invaluable until the last moment. After a final round of negotiations during the night, the ultimate version of the text is distributed, and one word provokes fireworks. Laurent Fabius again.
A number of paragraphs were to contain the word should, which in legal terms means not an obligation of results, but an obligation of means. That is to say, all countries committed to providing their best efforts, but could not commit themselves in a decisive international manner. And so the word should was used several times. And then bang, when the text came out of the photocopier translated into 5 languages, the languages of the United Nations, the should was replaced by shall. And shall is an obligation of results.
Todd Stern was also there.
The first draft came over the copy machine. I grabbed it since I was in charge. I wanted to read it first, and then I was the first one who saw that mistake, actually. As soon as I saw that, I got John Kerry and our top lawyers, Sue Binias, together.
Here's Laurent Fabius.
The American delegation, which was led by my friend John Kerry, came to see me, and John said to me, "Listen, Laurent, I'm sorry, we work together, etc., but that's not possible, because if it's an obligation of result, it has to go through the American Congress, and the American Congress, given its traditions, etc., will never accept it. Phew.
And Todd Stern again.
I think somebody, and I don't know who, decided, let's just make this a little stronger. Shall sounds a little better, except that you've created a disaster.
The devil is in the details. Shall has a future tense. Enacting then becomes a formal obligation, whereas should is conditional. Acting is only a recommendation. This slight but crucial difference drew red lines set by the Americans, among others. Todd Stern explained.
We wanted an agreement that was partly legally binding, but not entirely legally binding. And if it had been legally binding with respect to the targets, the emission reduction targets that countries were taking on, that crossed the line. It also would have crossed the line if there had been a legally binding obligation to provide a certain amount of monetary assistance. If it had been like, you shall give this amount of money, that also wouldn't have worked. So the basic red line was, we can't approve an agreement that's going to be rejected in the Senate.
The session is suspended, and comes the time for a final crisis management exercise. Laurent Fabius and his team had to explain to those who were delighted that a more restrictive word had been introduced that it was time to backtrack.
I had a long conversation, particularly with the so-called 77, that is, the representatives of developing countries, including the African delegate who led the delegation. And I finally convinced them that it was a simple typo, and we corrected that error.
Let's have a brief look back at the challenges of this negotiation. To succeed, it was necessary to bring together 196 delegations with interests, demands, and red lines that sometimes stood a world apart. However, Laurent Fabius and Laurence Tubiane's team knew they had a major stepping stone. The world's leading emitter of greenhouse gases, China, had decided to jump on board the climate transition ship.
Between Copenhagen and Paris, a great deal had already happened. In particular, China's shift in how it saw the global economy and its own place within it, and the bet that it made before anyone else, ahead of Europe, ahead of the United States, that green technologies would be its way to become, if possible, the world's leading economy.
Among the best China observers at the time was Li Shuo, now director of the China Climate Program at the Asian Society Policy Institute, an American think tank. He vividly remembers the diplomatic excitement that preceded COP21.
I was working for Greenpeace in 2015. I was leading our delegation, and during the Paris Climate Summit, I was, of course, on site. I was covering the conference for the entire 2 weeks. That year, I believe just about a month before the Paris Climate COP, the French president went to China. And he met his Chinese counterpart and sought for Chinese support for the success of the Paris Climate Summit.
A second decisive advantage, well in advance of the Paris meeting, was the rapprochement on climate issues between the world's two largest emitters, the United States and China, with one side not wanting to lag behind the other. Todd Stern, the US negotiator, was at the heart of the discussions.
I started working in a very concerted way with China all the way back to 2009. I met with Xi Jinping, my counterpart in Washington, and at that very first meeting I said, I think you and I can try to make climate change a positive pillar in our relationship. And Xi was open to that. It didn't really produce anything very successful in that first year of 2009. China was still, butting heads with us. But we made real progress. When Xi Jinping came in and at the beginning of President Obama's second term, they started interacting, and the most sort of famous and important piece of it came early in 2014 when we proposed to them the notion that the country's two presidents would meet jointly, announce our proposed targets for Paris, and in other ways work together to make sure that that the agreement got done. And that was a a 9-month secret negotiation, and it had to be secret because we couldn't let President Obama, from our perspective, walk down the aisle in the Great Hall of the People with President Xi unless what the Chinese were putting on the table was good enough.
It was finally in November 2014, a year before the COP, that the Chinese and US presidents announced their decision to resolve their main differences before the Paris meeting. While the remaining points of disagreement were only finally resolved in the final days of the COP, according to Li Shuo, the momentum provided by this agreement between China and the United States was decisive in bringing other countries on board.
This also resulted in a series of high-level joint bilateral climate statements. And all these statements broke ground. They really kind of prepared the groundwork for the Paris Agreement. Some of the provisions in these statements eventually made their way into the Paris Agreement. So that's just a very clear example of how the two biggest economies and emitters in the world work together bilaterally, reached agreements, and by doing so, led the rest of the world. They sort of set the rules when it comes to how countries should reduce their emissions, what will be the global goal for emission reduction, how do you ensure that countries, while they reduce their emissions, could be transparent, right, in terms of reporting their emissions. All those provisions, I think, largely could be reached because of U.S.-China agreement prior to the Paris Climate Summit.
So much for the good news, but this bilateral cooperation between the US and China didn't resolve everything, obviously. In the roadmap drawn up by the French, there was one key ambition: to make the Paris Agreement a very long-term process. Here's Laurence Tubiana.
The Chinese and the Americans thought that they would reach an agreement lasting at most 10 years and that it would then be renegotiated. That was the major obstacle because given the difficulty in negotiating agreements and all the uncertainties, the economic signal was practically dead. So the first task was to get first the Chinese and then the Americans to accept that this would be a lasting agreement with review clauses. A lot of the initial effort went into convincing them that, no, we're not going to start Kyoto all over again. We're not going to keep renegotiating. We need something that lasts for the long term, meaning no termination clause. But on the other hand, we need to adapt to technological and economic changes, including the fact that there may be crises, steps forward and back, along a pathway that still has to be fairly clear.
Et des allers-retours sur une trajectoire qui doit être quand même assez claire.
Of course, there were several thorny challenges to overcome. An extra hurdle was to convince emerging countries who, in the words of Laurence Tubiana, didn't really care.
Le mauvais moment, ça a été le G20.
The G20 in Turkey just before Paris was a challenging time. If we had stuck to the G20 conclusions, there would have been no point in coming to Paris. It was so negative. They didn't want to talk about climate, didn't want to talk about a global agreement, and saw no reason for so-called emerging countries to have emission reduction commitments. We came out of all of that pretty exhausted, thinking, well, the Saudis and the others don't want this. And it's true that if we looked only at the 20 largest economies, we would never have had a Paris Agreement.
On n'aurait pas pu avoir l'accord de Paris.
Not everything looked promising ahead of the big climate summit, far from it. So what could then convince the major emerging economies to approve the Paris Agreement? We asked one of India's foremost experts on climate issues, Arunabha Ghosh, founder and director of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW. That's one of Asia's leading policy research institutes on these topics. According to him, the trigger for India was the new philosophy at the heart of the agreement, which had shifted from a top-down approach to a bottom-up one. This means that from then on, it was no longer the international community telling each country what to do, but rather each country proposing what it was capable of doing to participate in the common effort. And that changed everything. It was nothing short of revolutionary. Arunabha Ghosh explains.
I think what changed was that over the 20-odd years since the signing of the UNFCCC Convention, it had become quite evident that the top-down nature of the way the initial protocols had been designed was not delivering the results that would keep us away from the worst impacts of a changing climate. The other thing that was becoming quite evident was that countries like mine were recognizing that there was an opportunity here for technology leapfrogging, for a system leapfrogging that was possible on the back of what was happening across the world. And number three, that the international negotiations were a reflection of what was already underway at home. And this is often not recognized. So it was very clear that developing countries were trying to tap into the resources that were available to them. So if you take these three things together, brought India and many other developing countries to the table in a way that they thought that this bottom-up approach might be tried out.
And on this front too, diplomacy was intense to ensure that the major emerging economies would not stand in the way. On the last weekend before the COP, having completed his carbon footprint, Laurent Fabius went to see the Indian Prime Minister, the President of South Africa and the President of Brazil. Finally, in these Paris negotiations, there are developing countries, that is, countries with smaller GDPs that aspire to improve their standards of living. Many of those are African countries and are already bearing the brunt of climate change, even though their contribution to global warming is almost non-existent. This is a diverse group of countries, but overall, they were united in the hope to reach an ambitious agreement in Paris as binding as politically possible. Nisreen El-Saim is Sudanese and is currently heavily involved in the negotiations for Africa. In 2015, as a student, she was in Paris for the Youth Climate Conference, and she remembers those mixed feelings, hope and disappointment.
We were very disappointed at the end, to be honest with you, as a Global South, also as advocates from developing countries, because the nature of most of the things in Paris Agreement was voluntary. We knew that even without voluntary, countries will not commit. And now with voluntary, it will be even worse, you know. It's just naming and shaming without really having legal implications.
Developing countries fought until the bitter end. They would have liked more shall and less should in the final text, which they nevertheless accepted. Michel Colombier explains this choice. He is co-founder and scientific director of IDDRI and a member of the High Council for Climate in France.
Ça, c'est quelque chose qui m'avait été ramené par un négociateur.
This was something raised with me by a negotiator who told me, "We do not yet necessarily find everything we need in this agreement, so we will have to continue negotiating on the aid that will be provided to us, on financing and so on. However, there are 2 points that seem absolutely essential to us, which mean that we could not be the parties blocking this agreement. The first is that, fundamentally, if this agreement were not concluded, if climate action were not accelerated, we would be the first victims. As negotiators, we therefore have a fundamental responsibility towards our countries. The second is that this agreement presents the climate and ecological transition as the establishment of a new socio-economic model, and as developing countries, we must be part of it."
And then there are the most vulnerable countries. They have long been the most ambitious countries at the COPs, and it's easy to see why. These include the small islands of the AOSIS group, the Alliance of Small Island States. Alexandre Magnon has been studying these territories for 20 years, their fragility and especially their population's adaptation to climate change. He's a geographer, formerly of IDDRI, and now a researcher in New Zealand and an author for the IPCC.
Their basic argument for a very long time, since the end of the 1980s, has been to say, but we, small islands, we will be the first to be affected by climate change, in particular the rise in sea levels. Our territories are small. The vital spaces for our territories are located at low altitude on the coast. And so the risk we run is quite simply the disappearance of some of our territories and major impacts on the other part of the territories we occupy on the coast. And that is a very strong emotional argument, which the media have obviously taken up. It is the question of the existential risks posed by climate change on human societies. And that has been a strong argument for small islands, in particular to push for the Paris Agreement to recognise the fact that plus 1.5 degrees of global warming by 2100 compared to the pre-industrial period was the key objective on a global scale.
À l'horizon 2100 par rapport à la période pré-industrielle était l'objectif clé à l'échelle du monde entier.
The wording, agreed upon at the last minute in Paris, specifically states that the signatory countries aim to limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees, making every effort to keep it at 1.5. In the plenary session, the intervention of the Environment Secretary of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific shocked everyone. Kathy Jetnil-Kijner remembers this moment very clearly. Today, she is a negotiator for her country, but 10 years ago, just outside the COP, she was campaigning with Marshallese youth for climate change.
I was an activist on the sidelines performing poetry during the Paris COP21. And I was being told by insiders that there was no way we would get 1.5 into that agreement. And so watching and witnessing the impact that the Marshall Islands had, that we had a part to play through our Minister of Environment at the time, Minister Tony de Broom, witnessing how he was able to negotiate that outcome to secure our safety was a huge deal. So I think 1.5 for me was a very personal matter. I think it was an incredible opportunity to protect vulnerable countries. Is it perfect? No, not at all. But I do think it was a big step forward.
COP21 in Paris is also the first time that so many other non-state actors have been involved in such an important meeting for climate. Laurence Tubiana remembers a flurry of cross-sector exchanges.
There was a lot of support, ongoing discussions with national and international NGOs, and mobilisation of scientists. It was truly exceptional. So it was a collective effort with both a shared fear of failure, which was incredibly strong until the very last minute, and at the same time a very broad mobilisation. And perhaps the hallmark of this 360-degree diplomacy, as I call it, was telling ourselves we have to open every door.
NGOs, scientists, but also communities, cities, grassroots organisations got involved, and also the private sector, companies convinced that the transformation of the economy was underway. For Sébastien Treillet, the executive director of IDDRI, this commitment, outside the political sphere of negotiation, played a very important role.
It's certain that in 2015 there was enormous pressure from economic actors who were saying to their government, we are ready to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions so you can be more ambitious than what you generally declare for fear of offending us, the economic community, or preventing us from having our economic growth. So this pressure was very strong. Economic actors, civil society, communities made commitments. So there was a collective dynamic outside the formal circle of diplomatic negotiation, which created both effects on states to put pressure on them, which also took pressure from states so that they moved forward.
It was at this time that a number of major sectorial coalitions emerged, including the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. Emmanuel Normand remembers this impetus. He's Director of Sustainable Development at Saint-Gobain, a major French construction company working in 80 countries worldwide.
It was during COP21 that the decision was taken to create a coalition, the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, whereas now one of the principal platforms in the construction sector. It brings together more than 250 organisations, states, governments, and a wide range of non-state actors, companies, NGOs, cities, think tanks, and others who decide to work together to understand what is needed to be done to transform the construction industry. This marked the moment when the issue moved from the hands of experts to a more general and widely shared concern.
Le moment où le sujet est passé des mains des experts à une prise en compte plus générale.
The outcome of this extremely broad mobilization is the Paris Agreement often described as historic, but ultimately, what makes this text a turning point in the fight for climate? Let's take a look at some of the key points with IDDRI experts. Initial answers with Sébastien Treillet.
Pour moi, il y a deux aspects historiques. Le premier, c'est qu'il était universel.
It has two historic dimensions. The first is that it was universal. That is, all the countries on the planet said, yes, I commit to doing things to protect the climate, and not just to adapt, but truly to protect the climate. And that's completely new, that it's so universal. The second thing is more subtle. It's that we're in a bottom-up agreement as opposed to top-down things, which would come from above. And it's this type of negotiation that didn't work before. Here we are, back in a process which is, the countries say what they can do with their national policy. We check every 5 years if it's enough, and we try to increase ambition together. That would not work. We have seen it in other cases such as biodiversity or global food security if we did not have this collective objective of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. Because here it means that regularly we can say to ourselves, in fact, we're not there yet, and we can measure the gap to the objective.
These ambitions displayed by each country, their climate plans, in fact, are what we call nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And that's a new and essential tool in the Paris Agreement. Laurence Tubiana.
Si on regarde ce qui se passait 10 ans avant, personne n'avait de plan climat dans...
If we look at what was happening 10 years earlier, there were maybe 150 countries which didn't have a climate plan. There were only 30, maybe 40 others that did. That was the big innovation at first. People realised that, oh yes, they needed to create a climate plan. The first NDCs, which were submitted in 2015, were very incomplete, and especially when we finally arrived in 2021, since that was the time when we had to submit the final ones. Countries had already begun to understand that this was something much more serious, which couldn't be done by consultants in a corner. There was definitely a learning curve during these 5 years.
Climate plans that must be implemented by countries in complete transparency by declaring their greenhouse gas emissions and the progress made in mitigation. Everyone accepted this transparency, and it's an important point of the Paris Agreement. The spirit of this text, explains Michel Colombier, the scientific director of IDDRI, is to introduce profound changes.
The
Paris Agreement sought to create a place for all countries within a common framework, whereas previous agreements tended to divide the world into separate blocks, each with its own role. We now understand that agreements of this kind do not work over time, as countries' situations evolve, merging countries that were previously developing countries, and so on. A second point that seems extremely important to me in the Paris Agreement is that it positions this environmental agreement as one that contributes to climate governance, without claiming that all governance can be achieved through it alone. It does not merely set rules that countries must follow, rather, it establishes a set of elements that can be taken up in other spheres of government: financial governance, trade governance, standards, the private sector, and so forth, which will guide the actions of stakeholders regardless of the strict implementation of the Paris Agreement's rules and procedures.
One last point on a frequently heard criticism. The Paris Agreement is not binding insofar as it does not impose mandatory greenhouse gas reduction targets on each country. Well, in fact, it's a bit more nuanced than that. Sébastien Treillet.
To put it simply, there's no world government. A government allows for a police force. When you don't have a government, you don't have a clear sanction mechanism. So there isn't an environmental agreement that creates any sanction mechanisms other than peer pressure, other than governments asking themselves, do we actually want to lose our reputation vis-à-vis other governments or vis-à-vis the civil society, experts and businesses, etc. Nevertheless, this agreement is binding in terms of having to regularly resubmit a certain number of climate policies adjusted to what we understand about the state of technology. And technologies have advanced massively, particularly the drop in the price of renewable energy, which has changed the context over the past 10 years. And so, having to regularly put climate policy back on the table is a commitment that is normally binding. And if it weren't a little restrictive, there wouldn't be so many battles, particularly from oil-producing countries, trying to minimise the content of what is being discussed in this forum of the Climate Convention.
De ce qui se discute dans cette enceinte de la Convention climat.
10 COPs later, everything is not perfect, far from it. But the Paris Agreement has created a political and legal framework, a framework supported by 4 pillars that remain the compass for global climate action today. First off, it's a universal agreement, meaning that all countries have a responsibility to act, but each according to their own capabilities. It puts forward a new vision for the economy, transformed and decarbonised to achieve a more resilient world. It's an agreement with no expiration date, which sets a long-term horizon and action plan. And finally, the 4th pillar, the cross-cutting and systemic nature of the Paris Agreement, whose objectives must be implemented and reflected everywhere, in all spheres of the economy and society. The goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius seems very fragile today. But is it unattainable, as a study by climatologists suggested in the spring of 2025? We know that every 1/10 of a degree makes a difference, and these Paris targets remain the compass that guides our efforts. We'll see all of this in the following episodes of this podcast. And I'll leave the final words to Chinese expert Li Shuo and Laurent Fabius.
I would definitely say that the Paris Agreement made a difference. It really managed to bring the political attention of all countries in the world on the climate agenda. Since the agreement, when world leaders meet these days, climate change is inevitably something that they will talk about.
In summary, we can say that while the Paris Agreement was extremely positive, the situation we are aiming for today is nevertheless not good, and that action must therefore not only be continued, but amplified. The problem is the application, the concrétisation, that the work is still ahead of us.
Ça, le travail est encore devant nous.
I'm Amanda Morrow for RFI. This podcast was written by journalist Sophie Larmoyer with editorial direction by Brigitte Bégin of IDDRI, and it was co-produced by Radio France International.